The Bloody Benders, Labette County, Kansas. The one case we know had a series of terrible, terrible things happen took place in Kansas in the 1870s. It's one of the most fascinating stories in American criminal history because it's a solved crime, but no one has ever been tried. In October of 1970, 5 families came to the land near Osage, Kansas. Kansas was seeing more and more people arrive to set up along the Great Osage Trail, which was then part of the Santa Fe Trail, which many traveled to get to the promise of the West. These 5 families had something in common. They were all spiritualists. Spiritualism was a new religious movement that flourished in the 19th century. Following the Civil War, a large number of people came further and further west, following spiritualists who had made the move to cities like San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, and the slopes of Mount Shasta. These 5 families stopped in Kansas, then one of the fastest-growing territories, and formed an enclave, with the Bender family holding 168 acres directly along the Osage Trail. The Benders were a family of 4. Those qualifying quotes are there because they may have merely been a criminal crew who lived together. There are good arguments on both sides of that thinking, but they presented themselves as a German immigrant family of 4. John Sr., Elvira, or Almira, or Kate Sr., sources vary, John Jr., and Kate Jr. The 4 of them arrived in Kansas in October of 1870, and they quickly built a one-room house. They actually divided the house into 2, using a canvas cover meant for a wagon. The canvas created 2 false rooms, one the personal quarters, and the other a sort of general store and inn. There was a table with chairs around it, with the head of the table closest to the canvas covering. Kate was known as a mystic and offered readings and lectures on the spiritual world. This was not anything too unusual. Many spiritualists would have done lectures or readings or seances in homes and parlors. And since the Benders had a space, they drew a fair crowd, usually one at a time. And that's the important part. Supposedly, there were 4 seats at the table, 3 for the Benders and 1 for their guests. The house was fairly cramped, and there were only windows on the front portion of the house. The guest would be seated at the head of the table and serve food. Sometimes it would start with Kate the Younger entertaining, and some say enchanting, the guest. She was the only one who spoke good English. She would disappear behind the curtain, and Mrs. Bender would bring out the victuals. As they tucked in, someone, whether it was Mr. Bender or John Jr., it is not known, would bash the seated guest on the head, and then, supposedly, Kate would slit their throat. Or so the story goes. Now, the area was known as a home to horse thieves and villains, as it was a rough-and-tumble part of the world. Life along the Osage Trail was never easy, and hard times built hard people. There were some early signs that things weren't all that great. There had been bodies discovered in Drum Creek, one in 1871 and a pair in 1872. They had crushed heads and slit throats. These events, along with a large number of folks who were reportedly lost along that portion of the Osage Trail, led a number of pioneers out towards the coast to go around Bloody Kansas. It was the late winter of 1873 that the first major crack appeared. George Newton Loncourt brought his infant daughter with him down the trail. Loncourt wasn't heading west forever, but was planning to return, and thus a former neighbor, one William Henry York, technically Dr. William Henry York, went looking for Loncourt. He stopped at Fort Scott, where his brother Ed lived, and then headed out again. He was headed for Independence, but never arrived. York had 2 brothers, Fort Scott Ed, and the Kansas State Senator Alexander M. York. Alex was not only a state senator, but also had been a renowned fighter in the Civil War. This was a man who was going to do what it took to find his brother. He came along to the Benders' place on March 28th, asking after his brother. They said he had stopped by, stayed with them, and left. But it's highly likely that he had run into problem with resident tribes in the area. This seemed utterly reasonable to the colonel, who had a delightful dinner with the Benders and went on his way. A few days later, he ran into a woman who said she had visited the Benders and had been threatened with a knife by Elvira. That was enough for Colonel York to head on back to the inn, though this time he brought a few armed men along. They arrived and spoke with Mrs. Bender, who went off after they repeated the woman's claim of being threatened. She called the woman a witch who cursed her coffee. Apparently, that was a strong enough reaction for the colonel and his armed men to leave. It did show that Mrs. Bender was not as English ignorant as had previously been claimed. Kate Bender told Colonel York that if he returned the following Friday, she would use her clairvoyant powers to help find his brother. The group convened afterwards and thought that the Benders, along with their neighbors, the Roaches, were clearly guilty of making people disappear, not to mention the bodies in the creek. They called a public meeting where they talked about the disappearances, and a decision was made. A warrant would be obtained, and every homestead in the area would be searched. It is possible that the Benders were there at the meeting. Now, Colonel York's folks made one major mistake. Even though they were his prime suspects, they didn't have the Benders watched. It took some time to obtain the warrant and set the searches up. Another local was driving his cattle by the Benders' place and noticed the farm animals looked like they hadn't been fed in ages. This was a mere 3 days after the town meeting. They got a posse together and headed out to the Bender place, though bad weather had meant it took a few days longer than they had planned to get it together. When they got there to investigate, the Benders were gone, daddy gone. They looked into the house and noticed the food and clothes were pretty much everything else was gone. There was a rank smell coming from beneath the house. Beneath the house was a 6-foot-deep pit, 7 feet at the top, 3 feet square at the bottom. It was clear that the soil at the bottom was soaked with blood. So, as you could do in those days, they lifted the house. It wasn't a very big house, but still impressive. They dug under the house but didn't find any bodies, but it was clear that the blood had soaked into the soil underneath, was more than could have come from just the 3 missing folks. So the search went out into the orchard and gardens around the house. This was where a dozen or more people were found, including Dr. York, who had been shallowly buried. These bodies all appeared to have been bashed on the head, save for a young girl, who had no visible injuries and may have been buried alive. They did find a few things, including a prayer book and a Bible. In one was the inscription, Johanna Bender, born July 30, 1848, and John Gebhardt, came to America July 1, 18, but is unfinished. Now, Mrs. Bender certainly would have been older than her late 20s, so it was likely that she was not Johanna Bender, with John Gebhardt being John Jr. Now, this has several things that might inform other things. One, if she was the daughter of John and Elmira Kate the Elder, then John simply may have adopted her family name. So it might have been that they were so off-putting that no one could get close enough to the Benders to know their real names. It's difficult to tell. Turns out, there had apparently been some close calls. A local priest had visited, saw one of the Benders' men concealing a hammer, and noped out of there, claiming that he had to see a man about a horse. Mrs. Fitz was visiting, and felt something going on behind the curtain, and got the hell out of there before anything happened. Both of those claims came after the crimes were revealed. Now, what happened to the Benders? They took their wagon and abandoned it just outside of Thayer, Kansas. They then bought train tickets to Humboldt. After another transfer, the foursome split, the younger pair apparently heading to Texas, while the elders headed to Kansas City, then St. Louis. Kansas was known for its vigilante justice, and several mobs were formed to go and capture them. One theory on why they were never seen again is that one or more of those posses captured them and lynched them. Another is that they all just died. There were reports of women matching the descriptions of Ma and Kate Bender throughout the rest of the 19th century. There was a fellow named Jack Flickening who was arrested in Montana and fit the description of John Bender Sr. They never managed to identify if he was Pa Bender, but they did keep his skull around until 1920, serving as a curiosity in a bar in Salmon, Montana. Thank you for listening to Food Criminals, Last Seating. Next, we're starting on 2 episodes that are going to be bad. Actually, it might actually end up being 3, depending on how I divide them up. On mob bosses being murdered in restaurants. So I hope you stay tuned. Food Criminals Last Seating is written, produced, directed, whatever you can do on a podcast by Christopher J. Garcia. Check out our Patreon. After this is all done, I'll actually be proofreading this whole thing and then releasing it to all the Patreon subscribers, and then it'll also be available on Kindle and other things, because why not? Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Garcia.